The first thing I want to say about this is that I am giving a very, very, very brief overview here. Um, I need it because I need to provide some context to talk about the Manitoba Schools question in our next video, but Metis history could be an entire course of its own. So this is not like a full sort of deep dive into that. Not that it's not important, it's just that I can't do that and teach everything else in Canadian history at the same time. So if you're not familiar, the term Métis is French for mixed. It is generally used to refer to the syncretic relationships between sort of indigenous and francophone populations. This is sort of a culture in and of itself that sort of develops its own language, its own sort of cultural traditions, its own practices, that in a lot of ways sort of blend the European and the indigenous. Um, there's a lot of sort of really in-depth conversations we could have about that process, about what gets pulled from either side. Very, very interesting. I can't do it today. Um, what I will sort of say, though, is that for the most part, that relationship, that tension, and that tendency to blend Indigenous and European ways of life um, means that the population of the Métis population tended to want to live a little bit farther away from the established settlements of Europeans than, for example, new immigrants coming from Europe wanted to. And that's because they wanted a little bit more space. So one of the main Métis settlements that we'll sort of talk about today is Red River, in what is now Manitoba. And it was settled, and there was a settlement in Red River composed primarily of Métis families before Confederation. And the land was under the control of the Hudson's Bay Company. We sort of talked about that a little bit. And after sort of Confederation, as the land was being transferred, and if you remember, we're talking about this in terms of early Confederation, history of Confederation, really shortly after Confederation, the Hudson's Bay Company recognized that they did not, in fact, wish to be in the business of managing land like that, so they handed it over to the Canadian government. And in that process of transferring land, sort of around that period, there was an increasing number of Anglophone and Protestant settlers. And that's important because that's sort of the intended audience of immigrants that the Canadian government was looking to attract. They were looking to attract Anglophone and Protestant settlers because they had a really strong interest in building an Anglophone and Protestant country, right? When we talk about many of the Anglophone leaders, certainly of the early days of the Canadian Confederation, they were trying to build a British nation. They were trying to build something that was homogenous, that sort of represented those sort of British cultural traditions and values. And you can see that idea reflected in a lot of ways when you look at the other forms of assimilation that they're trying to put together, right? They're trying to assimilate indigenous populations, they're trying to assimilate the francophone populations, because what they're really looking for in a lot of ways is to like almost recreate Britain without royalty. Okay? So that starts to cause a problem because if you want to maintain, if you're Métis and you want to maintain your own sort of community cohesion, then large numbers of Anglophone Protestants who expect their way of life to be sort of managed and who have closer relationships with the powers that be in Ottawa. So they have more support to get what they want from the federal government than you do, causes a problem. So Louis Riel, among others, and I know there are some of my students who can talk about Gabriel Dumont and all kinds of other sort of Métis leaders in this space, but there's a rebellion in Red River called, appropriately, the Red River Rebellion in 1969. This rebellion is armed, but by and large nonviolent. So this is a conversation, and what winds up happening is that as a result of that rebellion, Manitoba enters Canada as its newest province in 1870. If you take a look at the map in the PowerPoint presentation for this unit, you will sort of see an image that will explain why you may have in the past heard of Manitoba referred to as the postage stamp province, because its borders in 1870 anyway very much look like a postage stamp. It's just a tiny little rectangle. And that was a tiny little rectangle that was sort of intended and negotiated after the Red River Rebellion in a lot of ways to protect and preserve the rights of the Métis and their sort of way of life. Um, we'll get into some details about this, but there's a lot of sort of protection, I guess, for Francophone and minority religious rights in this sort of space. So the Manitoba Act in 1870 guarantees, it sort of establishes both French and English as official languages of the province of Manitoba. So it means that you should be able to make your point in the legislature in either French or English. You should sort of be able to read laws in either French or English. So in a lot of ways, this is a very early precursor to bilingualism, which doesn't happen in the rest of the country till like the 1980s. But there's that sort of piece, and then there's a protected right for Francophone and Catholic schools. And just sort of for some awareness pieces, this is one of the reasons why the people who sort of propose offhand that, oh, we should just eliminate Catholic schools, don't always understand how complicated this is, because, for example, the right to those forms of education are often guaranteed in the sort of founding documents of the province, and so it's a little bit harder than you think to get rid of it. Usually it means a referendum. But for that sort of piece, that was the idea. And the idea was that way the Métis population would have this space in sort of the province of what is now Manitoba to be able to preserve their way of life and to sort of participate in governance in a way that was really important, right? Because before this, like for the most part, the land had been run by the HBC and they didn't really have to do much of anything in terms of that, because the Hudson's Bay Company was like, basically, so long as you keep trading us furs, we don't care. And they were sort of more about trying to prevent like raiders and marauders and stuff like they weren't really interested in setting up a lot of the things that governments would ordinarily do, right? They weren't interested in negotiating immigration policy or property law or any of those things, because that wasn't important to the Hudson's Bay Company. So there's that kind of piece. And so that's what happens in 1870. 15 years later, one of the things that you see is that the way of life of the Métis has continued to be threatened and is continually sort of endangered in this process. So if you look, for example, at the photograph of farmland, which seems like a really weird thing to put in a PowerPoint presentation, but I will explain it because it's actually kind of important. So because of the sort of history of the Métis, and that the Métis are primarily the mix of indigenous populations and francophone populations, one of the things that that it's important to understand is that when they established farms, when you had sort of Métis families building farms, they generally built them along the French model. And if you want to sort of talk about that, we could do that, but that basically means that it's built along the seigneurial model. And what that means is that if you fly over a seigneurie, what you find is farms that are really long and really narrow. And they almost always border on some body of water. So you'll have like a river and you'll have strips of land that come up from that. And that's designed to ensure that everyone gets access to water for drinking, for irrigation, for livestock, for all of that kind of stuff. Okay? It also kind of requires that you know where the land is, in that you need to have some pretty accurate maps of what's going on, and you need to sort of set things up. You can't really set up a seigneurial land grant system if you don't know where the rivers are. You can't do it, because if you're basing everything on where the rivers are, you can't put this stuff together. Okay, so it relies on some accurate mapping, which is relatively late in coming in a lot of parts of Canada, right? We could have this conversation, but like Alberta in 2020 still doesn't have an accurate map of where the minerals might be in terms of mining. We just don't have it. So there's still some like lack of mapping that's important here. But one of the things that I will also sort of point you at when you look at that picture is that because everyone has access to water, and because in the 1800s, most people don't have, for example, running water that comes to their houses, one of the things that becomes really important is that many of the improvements on farmland are going to run on that border, really close to the river, really, really close to the river. That's where you put your house, that's where you put the mill, that's where you put all of these things, because that's where you put the well, because that is the easiest place for you to get to, right? You can't run a mill without water anyway, but you put your house and the barns and the wells close to the river too, because that means that it's easier for you to get water from the well in the middle of the night in the middle of a Manitoba winter, that kind of thing. So there's that kind of piece that's really, really important. The other sort of thing that I'm going to remind you of in this conversation is if you've ever talked to your grandparents or your great grandparents about the nature of setting up farms, it's important to remember that doing so in homesteading is extremely difficult, backbreaking work. You have to pull out every single stump. You have to cut down the trees essentially by hand. You pull out the stumps. You cut all of the wood down. You have to pick out all the rocks. You have to plow all the fields. This takes years. And in 1885, sort of in that period, one of the things that didn't happen in the negotiations after the Red River Rebellion was a sort of process to ensure that Métis families would get formal title to their land, that the Métis families would be guaranteed ownership of the farms that they had been working for generations. And so by 1885, one of the things that has happened is that there are a number of cases of Métis farmers and Métis families being sort of pushed off their land by newly arrived Protestant Anglophone settlers who are showing up with formal deeds to the lands that they occupy. And you'll see those sort of land grant decisions a little bit differently. So if you look, for example, at the photographs, right, of land, one of the things that you'll see is that sort of a more traditional prairie, I guess, allocation of land is the same one that you see if you're flying into Edmonton, giant squares, like quilt squares. And if you allocate land that way, it is entirely possible to have, for example, one Anglophone Protestant settler who now walks away with like 4 farms worth of houses and mills and improvements in barns. And that makes it really easy to set up a very prosperous farm because you have all of these improvements that are already made. So that's kind of an important piece. I'm going to get through some of this, and that's part of the challenge. Another part of this challenge is that the bison are disappearing, partially because as Anglophone settlers move west, you're disrupting habitat, you're disrupting, there's also sort of some hunting for that purpose. So all of those pieces are important, and in 1885, Riel returns from the U.S. to lead the Northwest Rebellion, the second rebellion of the Métis. And his initial sort of encouragement to the Métis population is to make their complaints to John A. Macdonald in Ottawa. And there are a number of people who do that, but it's not particularly successful. This becomes an armed rebellion, and the initial battles between the Métis forces and the sort of Anglophone Protestant, like this isn't really soldiers exactly, it's not a full-blown army, but sort of the people who are trying to enforce that law kill a couple of people. And what the response here is very, very, very different, in that Canada puts this rebellion down hard. 300 people die, Riel is hung, all of these sorts of pieces, and we've got a lot of discussions about whether Riel was hung because of his language or his religion. There's a lot of discussions around whether he's a zealot, is he a rabble-rouser, is he mentally ill, and a delusion of grandeur. If that is of interest to you, you can absolutely dig into it and stick it in our new information thread, that's fine. I just want you to let you know that there's a lot of discussion about what's going on in terms of Riel. But one of the things that I want you to understand is that there's 15 years, basically, between the Red River Rebellion and the Northwest Rebellion, but the responses are incredibly different. On the one hand, you create the province of Manitoba, and on the other hand, you sort of attempt to totally crush this rebellion overall. And I want you to understand that the big difference between those 2 points in time is railways. In that, in 1869, John A. Macdonald really couldn't get troops to Manitoba fast enough to put that rebellion down. They would have had 3 months to sort of they would have a really long time to sort of set themselves up and collect all of those things and do a lot of damage to the Canadian soldiers who would have been arriving. But by 1885, you can put them on a train and they show up in a couple of days. And that sort of changes the response possibility. So that's an important piece. I also want to highlight that, we'll get into this in the next one, but the question of Métis land rights still isn't settled.